Genji Village, Sengoku era. A blood-red moon loomed over the rooftops, the wind howling through wooden eaves, carrying the stench of soot and burning steel. In the village's darkest corner, the forge still blazed. Masaru, a master swordsmith, stood frozen before the unfinished blade. Sweat dripped down his wrinkled face, but as he wiped it away, it wasn't sweat anymore, it was blood. His cracked hands bled, crimson droplets splattering onto the glowing steel. And at that very moment, the sword trembled. A whisper slithered through the air, a breath, a sigh, or the wind passing through the hollow eyes of the dead. The hammer in his grip shook. Masaru knew if he struck the final blow, he would create his greatest masterpiece. But in that same moment, he understood. If this strike landed, what would be born would no longer be a sword. Just as he moved to drop the hammer, an invisible force seized his wrist. The next morning, they found Masaru slumped beside the forge, his lifeless eyes wide open, both arms severed at the elbows. Beside him, the sword lay untouched, unfinished. Genjutsu, no one dared to touch it. But war does not wait for fear. Years later, a young warlord named Hidetora led his men to conquest. He had heard of the cursed sword, and with the arrogance of a man who had never known fear, he claimed Genjutsu as his own. That night, Hidetora could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the slow, rhythmic pounding of a hammer. He opened his eyes. The room was steeped in darkness, yet he wasn't alone. A gaunt figure stood at the foot of his bed, its hollow eyes locked onto him. The next morning, Hidetora slaughtered his entire guard. He didn't remember doing it. He only remembered the sword in his hands, lighter than air, yet sharper and more insatiable than anything he had ever wielded. And each time the blade met flesh, the whisper returned. Each strike claimed another soul. Hidetora didn't realize. He was no longer Genjutsu's master. He was its puppet. No one who had ever wielded the sword had escaped its grasp. Once they touched it, they could never let go. Their skin fused to the hilt as if seared in place, forcing them to kill, to keep killing, until the sword consumed them whole. Over time, Genjutsu was no longer just a sword. It became something else, a nightmare that would never end. Centuries passed, wars ended, Genji Village was abandoned, left to rot, but the forge remained standing, untouched by time. No one knew where Genjutsu had gone, yet travelers who wandered too close to the ruins swore they could hear it, the echo of a hammer striking steel in the dead of night, woven into the howling wind. One day, a stranger arrived at the forsaken village. Inside an old hut, he found a wooden chest bound in rusted chains. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. His hands trembled as he unlatched the lock. The lid creaked open. The blade gleamed in the darkness. All sound vanished. The wind stopped. The flames dimmed. Then, from the depths of the sword, a voice whispered,